Thank you all for coming tonight. And I'm going to turn it right over to our speaker tonight. It's Claire Evans, and she will be telling you about the politics of tea. So Claire, take it away.
Well, thanks very much. I'll tell you a little bit about myself first, and thank you very much for joining this evening. I always answer the first question, most obviously in people's minds, and that is, why is this American lady talking about all these British topics? Well, I'll back up and explain. So, the easiest way to begin is in my childhood. Now, this won't be the entire show, I swear. My mother and I were Britcom aficionados on PBS. So I guess you could say I was kind of an Anglophile from way back because we got into watching shows like Are You Being Served and Faulty Towers and The Vicar of Dibley and just I always enjoyed the sense of humor. Well, that came in handy later. So fast forward many, many years. And I confess right away, I'm a retired attorney. And when I was in law school, I had managed to scrounge up enough money to study abroad. So I chose London. That's where I was for some of my law degree. And while that was terrific, they sent me home eventually, not for bad behavior, because the money was done and so was the course. And so it just so happened, as I talk to you, I'm live from my living room in Peoria, Illinois. This is where I met my husband, and radically, I tell you, I did not seek this out. He happens to be a Brit. It just so happened his company had sent him here to Peoria, and we met. And we dated for years, and I like to think of him I liked him to think of me as his tour guide to the United States. And that worked out, and we got married. Well, 6 months after we got married, we were moving back to the UK. His company wanted him back. So off we went, and we settled in a city called Peterborough. It's about 70 miles due north of London, and I had never actually been to that city before. A city is defined by does it have a cathedral, and Peterborough does have a beautiful cathedral. But it just so happened my degree, as my husband rightly pointed out in his sense of humor, which is delightful, it was about as useful as a chocolate teapot in the UK, a US criminal lawyer, that is. So I needed to find other things to do. So I toured around and I did pub dining and tea shop drinking and of course in daytime hours, and he would come with me because as the mark of a true local, at least on the weekends, he hadn't seen a lot of the cultural highlights of his very own country. So we had a great time, but eventually his company sent him back here. And I'd like to chat about it. And friends would ask me where to go, what to see, that sort of thing. And because I felt I'd had the benefit of seeing quite a lot. And every time we go back to the UK to visit family, we tend to go down to Cornwall, which is where his family lives now. That's the southwest tip that looks like a hook out into the Atlantic, like a little arm and a machine grabbing something. So I kept up on what was happening, and I still enjoy the country so much and saw all sorts. So I've spun these talks out of my life and things that I've done. So tonight is tea. If you are in the right place, this is good. My husband, once very stiff upper lip sort of person though, he got me by the shoulders and he gave me a little rattle, nothing too severe, and he just said, "Claire, tea is important." And I would offer to you that yes, if you live with a Brit, you find out it's very important. Not only that, but it's drunken excess compared to Americans. I'd say at the height of his tea drinking powers, he was on 6 cups a day, and that wouldn't be unusual for the rest of England either. So with that, I will get into the show, but before I begin, I always get this question first, so I have a little visual aid. So what sort of tea do the Brits drink? Well, I can tell you what they don't drink. Usually that is not Lipton. So unfortunately, if you have a big stash of Lipton, not exactly kosher if you're looking to be authentic. But what I have for you to see, there we go, is a very passable tea. Generally speaking, Brits like strong black tea, and it's generally taken with milk in it. If you want, you can have sweetener or sugar, no lemon, no honey. These are foreign concepts into tea. Iced tea, Highly controversial. Some people will drink it, some will not. Some think ice is an abomination in tea. This is PG Tips. So this you can see on it. England's #1 tea. I pay about $5 a box at my local grocery store in the international aisle. I do, and that's for 40 bags. When we lived in the UK, I could get 120 of those bags for about 89 pence, which would be about $1.20, because the tea flows there. So you pay quite a bit in shipping differences. However, that is a good one. Typhoo and Yorkshire Gold are two others that sometimes you can track down at TJ Maxx in the international aisle. So now that you know kind of where to begin, if you would like to have a sample someday of something fairly authentic, those are my recommendations of where to start. We're just going to talk about mostly black tea and processing. No fruit tea tonight. Fruit tea, totally different topic. They sell it in the UK. I love it. My husband does not. He calls it so-called fruit tea. So without further ado, I shall share my screen, and hopefully you saw a teacup when we began. That is the right thing to see, but we will launch into what exactly is tea. Well, botanically speaking, its name is Camellia sinensis, and it is the second most popular beverage in the world, secondary to water. So if you're wanting a tip on tea, how far does it go back? Well, how firm of a historian do you want to be? Because we definitely know that it's indigenous to the mountain regions of China. And those tribes that lived there chewed tea leaves because they grew there naturally. There was a treatise written in about the year 760 by a man named Lu Yu, and it was called The Classic of Tea. And it discussed all of the aspects of tea and tea making that was known to China at the time. And within it, there was a fable. And it said that in the years 2737 BC, very specific, a banished emperor plotted revenge, and he had sat to cool his sentiments under a tea bush. And some of the leaves of the tea bush happened to fall into the pot of water he was boiling. And he drank that water and he felt refreshed and pacified. And he stayed there for 7 years. And then after which he was inspired to return to his lands and make amends. And then he named the drink Thai, which is apparently in multiple meanings could mean peaceful. But if you want to put a finger on how old is tea, here's the evidence. Attorney, here's the evidence. In 2016, there was a discovery of a tomb, and it contained the world's oldest known tea stash. And it was in the tomb of the Jing era emperor, Li Qi. And that would have dated to 141 BC. Liu Qi, pardon me, not a native speaker. So pardon me if you, my Chinese, you can pick out as horrid. But that's when we know that tea was definitely on the scene for sure. So where do you grow tea? The next question. The tea picture you see here is actually from a tea estate in England. They have cracked the code on how to grow tea, and it's no easy thing. It is particularly difficult. It's persnickety. It requires a lot of things. Acid soil. It has a really oily seed, so you have to get it in the ground quickly, otherwise it rots. You have to have a lot of water, but not too much water. It loves the mountains because in botanical terms, if you garden, it doesn't like wet feet. It doesn't like roots that are soggy. It has to be well drained, and things on slopes are nicely drained. It has to be nicely warm. It can't freeze. It can tolerate cool, but not really cold, out of direct sun. And a good tip is if you can grow the species Camellia reticulata, which is the flower camellia, you could likely grow tea. So having said that, Americans have stumbled into where to grow tea, but it's certainly, we're not the tea producing regions of the world. By a region, primarily it's grown in China and India. If you are a tea drinker, you may recognize Ceylon. That's the old term for the island of Sri Lanka off the coast of India. So the American tea plantations are in the south. Mostly the big one that I'm thinking of is in South Carolina, Charleston Tea Plantation. I've heard they can grow tea other places, but they have to be really particular about the conditions it's in. So you can see all the different places that they have managed to get it to grow. Kenya is a big tea producing region, But here's a bit of a shocker. By population per capita, the UK is not the world's leading consumer of tea. It's actually third. And who's in line ahead? Ireland beats them, and so does Turkey. Turkey drinks a shocking amount of tea per capita, almost 7 pounds per person a year. I find that really big. US is way down that list. We're number 35 at a half a pound a year. And kind of funny enough, China is only a pound, 1.25 pounds a year, and they're number 20 on that list, yet they're the leading producing region. But having said that, I'll show you a little bit about what exactly do you get when you get tea, if you order it, and what are the different grades of tea? How good does it get? So the terms that I'm going to tell you about come from India and Ceylon. So they have their own nomenclature. China has a different method, but most of the tea market adheres to the terms I'm going to tell you about. So the short story on how good is tea is that the higher up on the tea branch, the plant that the tea is harvested from, the better the quality. So the finest bits of tea are taken from buds and tiny leaves at the very top. And that you can see is at the bottom of the list. Finest tippy golden flowery orange. They just go on and on with these flowery names, literally. But when you're working down the list, the lowest grade of tea, well, you can get into tea dust and things like that. They actually repackage that and sell it. But typically it's the fifth leaf that they don't bother with below. And that's fifth leaf is Souchong. And that's not a bad tea. It's just where does it fall in the grade of what's most esteemed. If you're a tea drinker and you've had orange pekoe, know that the orange in that name has nothing to do with the flavor orange. Absolutely not. It just happens to be a descriptor of the main grade of tea. That's the leaf after the tea bud plus the bud. So now that we have all that out of the way, back in the olden days of before machines got involved, and this is somewhat still done, the tea was a very labor-intensive thing. You required a lot of it to harvest, a vast amount of people. You had to have a whole lot of tea to get pretty little of a product. And then they processed it in a way they now is called orthodox. And all orthodox means is basically by hand. So they start with the tea leaves, and then it can diverge on the map depending on what sort of tea they're making. This would have been the Chinese methods. They would first wither the leaves no matter what. Then if it only went on to be steamed and dried from there, you get white tea. So white tea is the most minimally processed tea of what we're talking about, non-fruit tea. Then we're starting to add a bit more heat and some rolling. So once it's withered, steamed, or pan fried, so pan frying can add the element of fire, potential burning to things, and then they'll roll and dry it. You get green tea. That has a kind of a markedly vegetal taste to it. I think it's acquired. Some people really love it, some don't. I'm kind of in the don't camp. Doesn't matter. I would encourage you to try it no matter what. Then if you do a little bit of a ferment in there before you finally pan fry or dry it, then you get something called oolong, which a lot of the Chinese restaurants like to serve, that or jasmine tea. The Chinese were really good at putting flavors like bergamot and jasmine into their tea. Bergamot is bee balm, actually, oil of bergamot. It makes Earl Grey. It's delicious, in my opinion. And they got into fermenting because they started to trade the tea, and it had really long trips. So it would actually ferment on its own, on its way to its destination. And then when they got to fully fermented tea, that is black tea. If it's done well, it has a really interesting malty taste to it, and that people started to like. So that ferment was actually then started to be done on purpose. Well, leave it to the Brits, though, to make sure that they always had a ready supply of enough tea, because by 1931 they were well and truly hooked on tea. And in the run-up to the World War II, they were investigating equipment that could more readily ensure that they were sitting on an adequate national stash of tea to get them through the hard times. And that was true in the Cold War too. They do have projections of their national tea stores. So they invented this, CTC, they call it, Crush, tear, curl. Well, it's equipment. So it's putting a machine in charge of all of the processing. And they do those actual physical things that I described. And what's happening in the end is the tea is being formed into tiny pellets. The PG tips that I held up for you in the beginning, that is a CTC tea. So if you were to open a tea bag of PG tips and look inside, you'd see little pellets of tea. Why do they do this? Well, it's a lot faster, that's for sure. It's consistency. They like to get the same product over again. You don't have a person burning tea or pan frying it to the extreme. So it's still kind of a cachet, though, to drink a tea that's processed in the orthodox method because it's a more expensive tea. It's been done with more labor involved. But 95% of the world's tea is made in the CTC method. So people will claim that the hole in the cut leaf teas that are non-CTC, they have a little more flavor because they've been less monkeyed with, I suppose, in layman's terms. But as flavors go, it is an interesting job to be, if you're really into tea flavor, a tea taster. This is actually a profession. You'd have to have the proclivity to do it too. It's an art and an occupation. So you do a apprenticeship for 5 years at tasting, grading, and blending tea because it's a natural product. Companies like PG, that's a Unilever company actually anymore, they're interested in producing a very consistent product all year round because people rely on that tea to taste a certain way. But because it's a natural crop and the varying conditions of its growing, people have to have a nose and a taste for what to blend to get the consistency that the company wants. So they compensate their recipes at any given time for what's available. So as you were graduating from apprenticeship, you were responsible for identifying blindfolded the country and region of whatever tea they present you. And a lot of the tea tasters go on to work for the auction houses, for the companies they represent. They buy in the quantities of tea that will get them to blend what the product is they want to produce. So here's a big question. Well, why did he get to be so popular? Well, it's actually a pretty simple answer I'll expand on, though. The simple answer, it's a drug. It's a good drug. If you accept that there are more than 10,000 alkaloids, fancy chemical name for the drug compounds that we find in plants, morphine, strychnine, quinine, ephedrine, cocaine, nicotine, etc. Caffeine is one of the more mild of these, for sure. A stimulant, but not to excess. And it has a lot of other little fun features too. It will inhibit insects from eating those plants and fungi, but it occurs only in one North American plant. It has a horrible botanical name with an interesting story behind it. So the botanical name, it's called the yaupon holly. It grows in the southern coast naturally of the United States, Florida, Mississippi area, and it's called Ilex vomitoria. Well, that name was given to it on purpose. And the reason was it was used in ceremonies at indigenous peoples' special honorary grounds like Cahokia Mountains in the south of Illinois. They had a documented history of drinking this drink that's made out of the yaupon holly ceremonially, and then they proceed to be sick. Well, they're making themselves sick on purpose. It isn't that the holly is causing this, but what had happened by this time, tea was super popular, and the British, as we'll find out, wanted to absolutely keep the market on tea to themselves. And they found out that there's a caffeine-containing maybe tea substitute in North America. They want to make it sound as terrible as possible so that nobody would possibly want to drink this or bring it to market. So a clever botanist at the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, which is outside London, named it Ilex vomitorium. And so that, like I said, it is not a reflection of what it does. It was just how it was used. So another reason, though, is that it takes a whole lot less tea to make a cup, 5 grams of tea than it does coffee. You need 15 grams to make a coffee cup. And plus, you have to grind your beans. So tea starts to spread. as I told you, it began in the mountain regions of China. They're called the Wuyi Mountains on the coast. And eventually, Japan learned to cultivate tea from China around the 7th or 12th century. But then the first Western nation to want to import tea was Russia. And they had an awfully long way to go. If you were to drive the route from the Wuyi Mountains into St. Petersburg, you would spend a whopping 107 hours in the car. Now, granted, when they're doing their trade, they're doing it on camelback and in bricks, and it's fermenting and it's becoming black tea. And that became just fine. The return trip back and forth for this trade route, 3 years. Whoa. So where does this this tea name later in Britain becomes bohea, and it's a fractured version of Wuyi, the region it comes from. They would call black tea bohea tea, but it's actually they're trying to say Wuyi badly, or the language just did a twist of it and didn't get it very right at all. But interesting factoid for your collection. If you find yourself in need of detecting a Soviet agent ever, you can do so by observing the way they drink their tea. And that is because Russians typically drink their tea in something called a very long glass called a podstakannik. And they can stir fruit jams into their tea. They're very delicious, but they use these long silver spoons because they need to have a higher glass. Well, when they sip their tea, they don't take the spoon out, and they are conditioned from a young age, and you know they consume a lot of tea, to blink when they drink. So British agents would always observe suspected Russian agents of watching them, how do they drink their tea, to see if they had that reflex to blink. Because if they did, that would be a tell that they maybe were not raised where they said they were after all. Had a background in another country, wink, wink. So how did tea get into England? Well, we have a lady is largely credited with the introduction of it into the UK, Catherine of Braganza, and her dates are 1638 to 1705. So she's Portuguese. She and, well, her country was largely regarded, if you remember your world history, as the leaders in the age of discovery, of explorers of the world. And it was Portugal was a naval power in particular, and had lots of outposts as the explorers found more foreign lands. So the first European landed in China in 1513, and by 1517 they'd already got a trading post established by Portugal. And when they were trading spices, at the same time, they discovered that tea was profitable as well. So they sent it back to Portugal. The Portuguese court started to drink tea. And then Catherine of Braganza, who was a Portuguese aristocrat, married Charles II of England. And with it, she brought her Portuguese habits, one of which was drinking tea. And as it was a case of keeping up with Catherine, everybody at court wanted to be like her. So she, because she enjoyed tea, they all enjoyed tea. So it's she that gets the credit for introducing it to at least the aristocrats of English society. However, it was only affordable by them, but for a long, long time. Enter an interesting company, the British East India Company. There are other East India companies, not to be confused. There's the Dutch, there was the French, but we're only going to talk about the British. Then there's more too. But they were established largely to exploit trade throughout the world. This, what you see, the building is one of the later incarnations of their headquarters. They started quite small, actually, but they grew to be massive. And unlike any company that the world has ever known, it's almost, it blows our minds now when you know the facts behind it to understand how much power they actually had. If you were to go see the site of this building is no longer there, actually. It's right now, it's the Lloyd's of London Insurance Company's building in its business district of London, which is a really interesting modern building unto itself. But that's where it was located. It had a really long run. 1600 to 1873 had its own flag. So here's a few more facts about it. So it was definitely considered the world's first multinational corporation. They were the first, as I said, they wanted to trade, they wanted to make money. Spain and Portugal had a monopoly in spice trading, and they didn't want that to persist, and French and Dutch were on the scene too. So Queen Elizabeth established the East India Company by royal charter in the year 1600. It's the world's most powerful monopoly. It was then, and it's always been since. Nothing with this amount of power was allowed to exist again, and for good reason. We will find out. It had some twists, though, that make it actually not unlike modern corporations, one of which that it sold joint stock, which you know that corporations do today. It raised funds by selling shares, and it had a board of officers. But strangely enough, even in small numbers, at some points, there could be 37 people, for example, working in the offices of the East India Company in London. But because it was a political hybrid, that it had power over an entire country in India, its London office was the ruler of India, 37 people. It built the British Empire. So if you've ever heard the slogan, "The sun never sets on the British Empire," it's because of the East India Company. That isn't necessarily true anymore. But just to give you an idea, its entire crew, its staff, its sailors, its workers, its soldiers, they're mercenaries. They, at the height of their powers, had a private army in excess of 260,000 soldiers, which was twice the size of the British Army and larger than many nations. So it had some interesting players too, and some interesting policies. By interesting, I mean controversial. They, at their height, brought in half of the trade revenue for Britain. They weren't paying too well for people who wanted to join. Now, people joined out of desperation. They had miserable lots back in England. It was a hard time to be alive in some cases as a member of the working class. So this was an option. So to compensate for the fact that they lost a third of their workforce to losses at sea, it was highly dangerous. They're sailing to India. They allowed private trading, privateering. If you happen to be in the Rajah's palace, for example, and you spied a very particular ruby bracelet you might like, feel free to lift it. And on your next trip home, you sell it. And that was the culture. Smuggling. So they were known to be highly violent and highly corrupt. The branch office on the ground in India of the East India Company, they were basically the lawmakers for India. The London office didn't care what went on there for a very long time, as long as trade continued. So if we use a modern analogy, if you can picture Amazon taking over Seattle in its entirety, and then they have their own private army with guards. They start to exploit all the natural resources around. And then if you have any sort of dispute or any disagreement whatsoever, a middle manager for Amazon is going to be the mayor and the judge and the executioner of your location. So a tremendous amount of power on the ground, but over time, this is not sustainable. They began with just a power grab, but then the focus shifted a little later to getting into really unfair contracts with the Indian nationals. And they would pillage and plunder, and they collected taxes at a horrible high rate. They would enter into contracts for the locals to grow opium at rates that the locals would go out of pocket, actually, to fulfill the contract. So there was no way to even make money. So finally, in 1784, the UK Parliament, that is their governing body in the UK, passed something called the India Act, and that reined in East India a little bit. It made the British government the ruler of the land in India and not a private company. So let me talk about the man that you see in the picture. His name's Major General Robert Clive, aka Clive of India. Interesting man, shall we say, wink wink, controversial. You can see his statue in the UK if you go to, in particular, I think it's on Shaftesbury Avenue in London. But he, by background, was a juvenile gang leader, and he was bipolar, and his father sent him to India to, quote, get rid of him, unquote. He began as an East India clerk, they would say clerk, and he basically got himself worked up the ladder. He was very ambitious, and by the time he retired, he had amassed the largest, he was the wealthiest self-made man in all of Europe. and the modern equivalent of about $24.3 million he walked away with. Now, was the company paying him that? No, he worked in an atmosphere of help yourself. In fact, it's telling that at the time in his tenure that he was in power at the East India Company, a particular word entered the English language from Hindustani, and it's the slang for plunder, and that word is loot. So that will tell you a little bit about how he was and what sort of culture that he perpetrated, I think is the right word. So tea begins. The tea trade is going on between China at this point and the UK because India hasn't cracked the code. This talk is going to be basically a parabola, or how tea starts from China, but the production starts slowly. What the UK wants is to shift it to India. That is not an easy thing. But there's lots of different growth spurts, shall we say, that they ultimately need to get tea production into India because they control India. And they are such consumers of tea after a while that it's in their best interest to do it. So back at the ranch, though, they're still trading with China. And what they're getting is along with the tea, they're a really consumer-driven culture, even in the Georgian era and before, that it was very trendy to own anything that was coming back from China, in particular blue and white porcelain. And it was really an afterthought that captains would throw in with the tea when they came back from China as ballast. They needed it for their ships, but it turned out it was beautiful and people really took to it. So it was quite the cachet to drink your tea out of these cups. Now, granted, you could only do that if you were super wealthy at this point, because in order to buy a pound of tea in 1665, you'd have to cough up modern equivalent of between $182 to $571, when the average person made maybe somewhere in the middle of that, more at the maybe $200 a week. So you're not talking many people. In 1700, 70 pounds of tea were brought into Britain. So 30 years later, that number went from 70 to 1 million pounds. And then by the 1790s, it was 20 million pounds. So exponential growth, anyone. This is why they had to get away from China. And there's other reasons too. So another reason, though, that tea became so popular was a sad circumstance, actually. If you remember from your U.S. history classes, it's the North American slave trade triangle. So what was happening is that the UK was trading cotton fabric and manufactured goods into Africa. A company largely responsible for this part of the world's trade in slaves was the Royal African Company, that they document were responsible for trading about 212,000 slaves out of West Africa into the British West Indies. The East India Company did trade in slaves also, but not nearly to the extent that the Royal African Company did. So once slaves were caught in West Africa and they would take them to the colonies, then they would use that labor to produce one of the things on the list, sugar. Sugar, rum, coffee, cotton, tobacco, and silver. Well, the UK is sitting on a glut of sugar, and it's an expensive commodity, but they needed somewhere to put it. Well, tea's not a bad idea. Slavery overall was made illegal, or the slave trade, I should say, was abolished in 1807 in the UK. However, it was never explicitly legal. But what would happen is in colonies, as we know, there were slaves, and it was kind of a blind eye got turned in some situations. So tea is on the uptick for a number of reasons. That's one. And here's an example of commercial uptick. If you were to go today to the Strand, a street in the middle of London, very commercial district, you would see the shop. It's still there. This is Twinings. They pronounce it Twinings, believe it or not. Usually Americans hear Twinings, but the UK ads on television will say Twinings. He opened the shop, Thomas Twinings, in 1706, and it is the longest standing business logo, believe it or not. They still use the Twinings logo on the tea boxes just as you see it. And he got famous for blending to suit customer tastes. He would make whatever tea blend you'd like on the spot. This shop, though, I would pass all the time when I did study abroad because it was on my way to various places. It's tiny. It's so small. It's very skinny, which is typical of a shop of that era. But I find it very interesting. And all of the UK that way has these really throwback buildings and all sorts of unexpected places. So if tea is on the uptick, where do you keep it? The earliest places would have been in tea caddies brought over from China, the blue and whites. Those are remarkably valuable. If you get one of 1680, it's going to be in a museum, most likely. This is the one you see, the blue and white, is in the Victoria and Albert Museum. But as time passes and Britain's on the tea wagon, shall we say, they're making tea caddies that lock, because you had to keep it under lock and key. Otherwise, the lady of the house would see the servants running off with really expensive things. So the little boxes inside, one would have a G, that was for green tea. B is for Bohea, remember, that's the part of Wu Yi, the mountains of China. And then the little bowl in the middle, it's controversial. It was either for mixing or for sugar, your choice. But the Georgians, that is the people who lived in the reigns of the three George kings, George III was the one that's on the throne at the US Revolution point. That's the Mad King George. That's one that I find easiest to remember. They really got into carving these really intricate and beautiful little tea caddies, little fruits made out of satinwood. They're very valuable, actually, at auctions. So I will come back to you for just a second, and I'll show you. Now, this isn't valuable at all. We collect antiques, so it's kind of fun. I have a tea caddy, and it came from an antique show in the UK when we lived there. And this is maybe not quite 100 years old, so like 1920s time. What is interesting, though, about it is that it would have been made the same way that the shipping crates were made to ship tea back from China. It's lined with tin. So I have my tea in there. But the tin in the inside keeps it fresher longer. See, even the lid is lined with tin, and it just clicks shut. And as I say, tea by this time had gone into mass production and was meant for the masses, so it wasn't near as expensive or cachet as it was before. But I think you could track that down. Once in a while, one will pop up like it on Etsy. I just thought they were interesting. So if you are in the tea society of the time, oops, I've skipped a slide. Here's somewhere you might go, and that is Vauxhall Gardens. That was the first of London's famed tea gardens. Now, if you watch a show called Bridgerton on Netflix, you might have heard of this place. It opened in 1732. What they would have served you is chocolate, coffee, and tea with bread and butter, and it would have cost 4 shillings to get in. But even 100 years later, in the 1830s, 4 shillings is about a quarter of what a stall keeper, a very working class person, would make in a week. So it was really quite the treat to go, and meant for the aristocracy and upper classes. Today, remarkably, Vauxhall Gardens is nowhere you want to spend any time. That tea garden's long since gone. It is a public park, but it's not in a great area of town. It's the subject of urban renewal, let's say. But that's kind of interesting that used to be the place to be. Now, if you were really posh and you wanted to go every night, you'd buy that lovely trinket on the left, and that was a sterling silver season pass to Vauxhall Gardens from 1750. If you want to see it, that's on display or can be found at the Victoria and Albert Museum of Decorative Arts in London. So that by itself was quite expensive. Tea is wheeling into society slowly. It first was introduced to more people through coffee shops. The first coffee shop opened in Oxford in 1650. Only men were allowed in these places. Boo. This is true of many, many themes of British history and world history, frankly, that excluded women for a long, long period of time. And so they would sell loose leaf tea in these coffee shops for men to take home to their wives. And it was promoted as having medicinal qualities. And you needed less to make it. You didn't have to grind beans. So it was starting to catch on that way too. And then it was still outrageous, however, because tea was taxed at a rate of up to 119%. until the year 1784. How ridiculous. So its entire value plus 19% is what you're paying just in tax for a tea. And then, of course, they're making big money. That's 10% of England's total revenue. So after much protest, they dropped that tax on tea through something called the Tax and Window Act. So if you've ever been to the UK and you're looking in the buildings of the Georgian era, that would be 1784-ish, you may see buildings that have walled up windows. And that is because that's the payment system to get the tax on tea lower. If you owned a building, you were taxed property taxes based on the number of windows your building had. So in order to dodge taxes, you would wall up your windows. And you can absolutely see these today. If you have a keen eye and you look around, sometimes not such a keen eye, it's just there for you to see. And I always think it's like a beautiful person's face that has a big black eye, when these windows have been made into sheets. So taxes on tea, anyone? That rings a bell for Americans in some respects, if you remember your US history. So tax on tea has always been a problem. This came to a head in the United States at the Boston Tea Party, 1773. And there were other tea parties, though, in other ports. This, though, is the one that got famous in the US history books. And in Boston, they managed to dump 342 chests of tea. Whoa, that is a lot of tea. And what was happening, backstory of that, is that the English East India Company had a glut of tea that they needed to move. It was sitting in their warehouses in the East India Quay. And they sought and received the permission of Parliament to tax the colonies to send them this tea. Hence, no taxation without representation, anyone. So they passed this Tea Act that legalized this tax so that East India could move this tea. Well, it got to the colonies. Some protesters were more successful than others in resisting unloading, but the governor of Massachusetts was a holdout. He refused to send that tea back. Well, so people snuck on board and whoosh, over it went. This was about the last straw. This was one of the preludes to the Revolutionary War. It only took about another year or less for full war to break out in 1775. So talking about that super high tea tax rate, 119%, it caused something else of interest to go on, heavy smuggling, and something called smooch. What is it? Fake tea is smooch. It was gross what they would do. Now, between the people in the back quarters of wealthy homes that would recycle tea, they would actually dry out tea leaves from the household and resell them out the back door for working class or people who wanted it at lesser rates. It was growing in popularity, so there was the market. It was starting among the working classes to replace some other beverage that wasn't so good, gin and sometimes ale. So there's a long history in gin days. They called it Blue Ruin in London. People were absolutely alcoholic, hooked on gin. Well, this is a step in the right direction, but not if it was one of these things. All these different things mixed in, tannin, sugar and molasses isn't so bad, but clay and woods, plus all the different leaves of different plants, ferrous sulfate, not good, poisonous, and sheep's dung to make it look that dark color. They had fines and even prison terms, but they didn't work. People smuggled anyway. Something else that was developing too is they were adding milk to their tea. This is how this caught on. A lot of cultures do this. In particular, one example is Tibet. They add butter to their tea to make it richer. It's to make it more fortifying. That's one reason. But another reason was that by this time, Europe was really mad about trying to produce the porcelain that was coming out of China to replicate, shall we say. And they weren't having the easiest of times to reverse engineering it. The porcelain from China was really durable. It was excellent quality. And the European makers, not so much. Theirs would crack. And they had not perfected the exact recipe of what sort of porcelain or what clay to put in their porcelain to make it that durable. Well, the milk tempered the temperature, and it would help it not to crack if you're adding something really hot to something that is less than cool. So the other thing is that the quality of the tea could be poor, and milk might be kind of a way to dilute that a bit. The Chinese used to throw away their first cup because it's a natural product. It's made agriculturally. And it was, they should say the devil had contaminated it, but it had a 6-month voyage too at sea. It might not taste so good. So is bone china made of bone? Yes. It's also, when they finally did crack the code, they discovered that they needed to put a type of clay in it called china clay. Kaolin is its name. And they have in the UK deposits of china clay in various places, in Cornwall in particular. It's really fine. It's got a lovely fine texture instead of the coarseness of pottery clay. And that's the secret, that you have to make the china that's durable out of a particular sort. So as the culture grew to want it and crave these products, there's a pattern that emerges called blue willow. It's not just by one maker. There were about, oh gosh, I think I read 27 different makers of blue willow. It's kind of a prototype, and it's not necessarily from China. It's what Europe thinks that Chinese blue and white ware should look like, or they have certain, shall we say, conventions. There's a short list of things that's always in traditional blue willow, and it can be made by any number of companies. And some of them are willow trees, pine trees, Chinese pine trees, a bridge and 3 men, a fence, a boat, a tea house or pagoda, and birds in flight. And this is where I like to show you, not too terribly long ago, I found a riff on that. And it's this. This pattern is called Things Could Be Worse by a brand called Calamity Ware. And instead of my 3 birds, I have a pterodactyl. There's my other pterodactyl, and there's my other pterodactyl. There's my 3 birds. I have a yeti. I have a spaceship at one point. There's a vicious sea monster. Let's see. There's my yeti. But I just think that this is a spoof of that pattern. And I love blue willow. But now that I have this, I can't drink my tea out of anything else. I just like it too much. So another reason tea is catching on are the health benefits. And in particular, I love this cartoon. This is a lady from London who's examining under microscope the water from the River Thames. And she's so horrified, she's dropping her cup of tea. So London in particular had horrible sanitation problems, especially in the middle of the 19th century. They had cholera outbreaks continually. Oh, I just got a question. It's about that teacup. So I will type it in at the end. How's that? Remember, if someone would remind me, I'll drop it in the comments and I'll say it again. Their water's horrid. They have animals that are hanging out among people, that all that waste is going into the sewer, and the sewer's mixing with groundwater, and it's mixing into wells. And as the tea prices are coming down, people are getting better. And that's because they're drinking more tea, which is boiled. And that's great. So it can keep them going throughout the day, if they're adding milk and sugar instead of the alcohol that they used to rely on. So the rise of the population of Britain really relied on the adoption of tea, because they were a much willer nation and they had better growth and survival rates too. Having said that, then people think, well, what was it like to have tea, and where did they do it? Tea in the Regency. So the Regency is the era right at the end of the Georgian era, and what it is referring to is the Prince Regent, that is Mad King George's kid, had to take over at the end because he's mad, and he's known as the Prince Regent. So that is the period called Regency, and that's the era of Bridgerton, and a lot of Jane Austen happens in the Regency. She was alive during that time period. There's a woman named Queen Charlotte. So she was wife of Mad King George. And if you watch Bridgerton, they have interpreted her as Black. And that has a historical basis. She was reputed to have Moorish history, and Portuguese too. That would have made her complexion darker. So they've taken some liberty with that and turned some of the more, traditional race roles on their heads. In Bridgerton, you have a whole lot more diversity than you would have in history, but the price of tea is starting to tank a little bit. People are eating a later dinner. They eat at 7:30 at night, and then they take tea after. They might have games, and if you were at a ball, they would provide you tea as a refreshment if you could find a man to escort you to the tea room. well, here we go again. And then, of course, if you were a guest at a pleasure garden, and if you had a visitor, you could offer them tea. So in real life, here is one of the funny things about the UK. This happens all the time. Sets and filming locations. On the top, you see where Bridgerton filmed Gunter's Tea Shop. That is a set, and it was a real place in the era that actually was located in the middle of London, Berkeley Square, which is a very posh Tony address. About 9 prime ministers are linked to it. Well, as it was a real place, they did not go there to film, but they used the city of Bath, and in particular, they used a plumbing supply house. Bathrooms at number 5 is Gunther's Tea Shop in Bridgerton. And isn't it beautiful? Why couldn't it be? So the real tea shop did a business, and it particularly catered to chaperoned women. They had to be, remember, they can't be out without male accompaniment or by themselves. Until there's women's suffrage that comes into play in the 1880s. Then the tea shops become a hive of activity for organizing. And ultimately, they get suffrage in 1928. But it was for a long time that they weren't allowed. They just have to have somebody from the tea shop run something out to their carriage and then go take it home as a takeaway. Oh, brother. So the race is on. They are the British government finally ended the monopoly of East India Company in 1834. So what they're trying to do is increase trade to run tea from China back into the UK, and it became a big race. The clipper ships. So then it was state of the art. The clippers went really fast, and they cut major time off the travel. They used to go 8 months at sea to go to China, and they're cutting that down to 3 and 4. And big crowds would come into London when the clippers were spotted with they call it the first flush. That's the first picking of tea of the season. And they would take bets on when it was going to get into East India Key. Well, until 1838, the only source of tea for Great Britain was China. And they know they want to grow in India. They are totally addicted to tea by this point. And in order to make it viable, they have to do it on a big scale. There is a reason that they really desperately want to get around China anymore. It's because they're going broke. They are paying all of their silver in their national coffers to China for tea. So to offset what was happening, they began, you could say trade. It wasn't. It's drug running, if you want to call a spade. This is it. They were trading drugs, opium, from India, which they controlled, and they were smuggling it into China. It was totally illegal in China. The emperor banned it, and they did it anyway. So the opium clippers would land, and they would illicitly trade this opium for tea. It didn't have much effect even to be banned. They only accepted money in coined Mexican silver in China. And the ministers of finance back in London were really worried that they were spending all of their hard currency on tea. So Britain was just surging opium into China. They were sending, for example, in the year 1830, 18,760 chests of opium went to China that year. And the Indians are producing it for nothing. And then but they would still use it in Britain. 300 chests went to Britain. Now they're using it for things like making laudanum, morphine, the derivatives that are coming from opium, but they really desperately wanted to get away from that. So they tried by diplomatic means to open up better trade, to get another arrangement. So Mad King George orders his ambassador to China, Lord Macartney, to ask the emperor for a different way of trading to lessen the restrictions, because Westerners couldn't even go outside the certain ports that Chinese allowed them to land in. They couldn't go inland at all. And they got this reply: as your ambassador can see for himself, we possess all things. I set no value on objects strange or ingenious, and have no use for your country's manufacture. It behooves you, O king, to respect my sentiments, and to display even greater devotion and loyalty in the future. Talk about insular. Chinese were not letting go any sort of secret. They didn't want to trade. They really didn't want to trade. They were completely self-contained, and they wanted to stay that way. Well, on the way out, the the ambassador felt free to transmit a few tea seeds to the botanical gardens in Calcutta, and they sprouted. Good, it can be done. However, so they're still running opium into India, from India into China at this point. And in 1839, it came to a head because China took English opium traders hostage, and they seized 3 million pounds of opium, and it started a war. The Anglo-Chinese War of 1839. There were a couple of opium wars. Now, naturally, the Brits had much greater naval prowess. They sent steamers over, and they ended that matter. But in the process, they actually opened trade quite a bit, and they got Hong Kong. So that was how Hong Kong came to be established. However, what had they done? What ruinous things had they done? In 1906, it was estimated that almost a quarter of all adult male Chinese were addicted to opium. So if you thought that there was just a modern drug problem in the masses as a societal issue, this has history. It goes back quite a long way in other contexts. So more surging of we need tea and we need it now. Afternoon tea is credited to Anna Russell, 7th Duchess of Bedford. She was as a member of the aristocrats on this strange eating schedule where she wasn't going to eat until 7:39 at night, her dinner, and she reported a sinking feeling. And so she ordered tea to her boudoir, and they would have light lunch, and she would sometimes invite her friends. Well, this is a thing now, a social event. Tea needs to be produced cheaper now more than ever. Here's where it gets interesting. The Victorians now, they have heard about this man named Robert Fortune, and he rose to fame. He's a botanist. He's a self-trained botanist, and he was an expert at undercover Chinese work. He infiltrated basically China as an undercover Chinese Manchurian, he called himself, and he hired 2 fixers that were native. And he got inland, and he wrote a wonderful travel journal. He evaded death on many occasions. And the people at the East India Company got wind of this, and they hatched a plan. He was such a good botanist that and a plant collector, he was a success at bringing lots of garden staples, now that we know, into the West. Bleeding heart, winter jasmine, white wisteria, 12 different rhododendrons and chrysanthemums. So they hired him. In 1848, they approached him, the East India Company, because they're trying to crush this awful monopoly of China. They want to bring production of tea into India on a grand scale. They want him to smuggle everything known about tea into India. Well, that's corporate espionage, to observe undercover what's being done, report on it, and take it somewhere else. But he wouldn't have seen it that way. It was more, this is the world's plant, and it's up to me to share it. Well, he tried, and he was successful. First, he got out about 12,000 plant starts in something that was very state-of-the-art called the Wardian case. And it's a completely sealed terrarium, and the key is sealed. You water it, you plant your seeds, and you water it, and you seal it, and you don't open it until you're ready to put them in the ground, because it creates a microclimate. And these seeds had to travel by sea, and the conditions were awful. Salt spray and bad climates, and fresh water was a problem. Well, and as I said, they're oily seeds. If you leave them out, they'll rot. He sent all these plants over to India. They got there, they looked beautiful, and at the port, they opened the cases, and they lost them all, to the tune of 12,000 plants. Whoa. So he tried it again, and he was successful. He ultimately got what would be the first of the tea plantations started by what he was able to smuggle out of China. Other things too got smuggled out, quinine and rubber trees out of South America into other parts of the world. But he discovered something else in his observations. He saw that the Chinese, in their orthodox methods, were adding things to green tea. In particular, they were adding Prussian blue, which is cyanide, and they were adding gypsum, which is a yellow paste when it's cooked. And these 2 things make green. What they very innocuously thought that they were adding green color to their product to make it more palatable for sale and get higher prices from the Westerners. Well, they were inadvertently poisoning people in slow, tiny amounts over time, but nothing good for people. Well, he wrote a pamphlet about it, and so green tea really fell out of favor. So the UK nation even today is very heavily skewed to black tea. So if you were to go, now you have access to afternoon tea in spades because these tea plantations are getting established in India. This is what you'd have: all sorts of lovely things that are savory, and sometimes the sweets are scones, hot buttered crumpets, and fruit cakes in winter with different types of tea depending on the season. So this is a major social event. Afternoon tea is what this is referred to, not high tea. Sometimes Americans think high tea is the fancy tea. It isn't, actually. High tea is referred to the what meal are you eating? So, for example, my father-in-law will ask my daughter, "Puppet, what did you have for tea?" And what he means by that is, "What did you have for supper?" Um, or high tea, basically. I'd eaten at a higher table by working classes. That's the source of that phrase. So when Americans think fancy tea, they're thinking of afternoon tea. And that's the recipe packet that goes along with this. Some of the favorites that are authentic, what you would find if you go to a lovely setting of afternoon tea. So if you were to go, this is actually years later, I was arm twisted to go to the Ritz for tea when I studied abroad. Ooh la la, it was worth it. It was darned expensive. I want to say back then, we're talking some years ago, at least 35 pounds a head for afternoon tea. No, we're talking light lunch, but still, that would have been easily $60-$70, and it's only gone up from there. But if you read what the Ritz is now offering in their tea menu, it's very authentically good. First flush, you'll see some of the boxes. I've highlighted the terms we've talked about here. That's the fruit, the first picking of the tea. There's a typo. It should say Assam to be orthodox. So that's handmade tea. So that's going to be expensive. Earl Grey, we talked about. The Chinese particularly add oil of bergamot and as one of the additives to make tea taste a particular way. That's a good one. And then chunmi is one that says it's green tea hand rolled and pan fried. Well, there you have it. That's orthodox too. So you can have some lovely luncheons if you go. However, be prepared to pay. But you don't have to. If you're in smaller circumstances, you can go to regular tea rooms, and they're everywhere in the UK. And they'll put a tea cozy that you see, a little quilted hat over your teapot to keep it warm. As I just talked about, that high tea is a tea that you eat for a meal, really. Dinner with your tea would be high tea. Usually meat and savory items are served too. So that would be definition of what is high tea. What did you eat there and what kind of circumstances? Not terribly fancy. But just so you know, if you're ever asked, what is a cream tea? That's something totally different. That's scones, jam, and clotted cream served along with your cup of tea. Particularly Cornwall is the home of clotted cream. It is a delicious condiment that is really not like anything that you can get in the US. There's an Instant Pot recipe for it that's really good. Now, that's been vetted by somebody who lived in Cornwall for many years, i.e. my husband, that says it's thumbs up. So if you ever wondered, well, what happened to the East India Company? They had terrible mutiny, as you may imagine. 1857, they tried to revolt, that is, the Indian nation. It was not successful, but it didn't last much longer because in 1873, they dissolved it entirely. It ceases to exist. Britain rules India. And then the evolution of it from today goes on. But in 2005, an Indian businessman bought the rights to the name, the East India Company. So you can find various tea things that are made by that company. It doesn't have a link to the original, kind of a good thing. So people ask, if I brew tea, what should I do? If you want to make loose leaf tea, well, first, if you don't, no big deal, because 90% of all tea in Britain is tea bag tea. No big deal. You always use fresh water. Don't reboil your water because it needs to be freshly oxygenated to have the best flavor, and oxygen gets boiled off every time it's reheated. You don't let it steep indefinitely. That's called stewing your tea, and that's pretty gross. They'll actually give you more hot water to dilute down in tea shops if you accidentally stew your tea. But about 4 to 5 minutes brewing time, and then 1 teaspoon per person, and then 1 for the pot. So I show you an example of something called jasperware. That was Josiah Wedgwood. He was the maker of Wedgwood pottery, and jasperware in particular was one of the first to crack the code on really durable porcelain suited for tea consumption. So it's super hard wearing, and they still make it. The early stuff is quite valuable. Not so valuable if it's later. And I dropped in the comments, and I'll mention again a couple of books if you enjoyed this, but in particular, the Robert Fortune story is told in this book called For All the Tea in China. And if you like true crime, that's exactly that. It reads like a espionage, but it all happened. So I would suggest that to you as well. So there you have it. That was the sum and total. If anybody had any questions, I definitely am reminded that someone would like the source of that teacup again. So I will come back to you and stop share. There we have it. It is called, oh, let me think of it. The name of the maker of the company is called Calamity Ware. And they do all sorts of fun little spoofs of patterns. If I can spell it, where? And then the name of the pattern is Things. I can't type and talk at the same time. It's like chewing gum. Could always be worse. Be worse. There we have it. So you can track that down. They will happily sell you all sorts of tea mugs and the matching plates and whatever you would like to have to go with it. So did anybody have any questions they might have thought of along the way? Let's see. While you wait too, I'll sneak in my jasperware.
Very nice.
A cheeky piece of jasperware, and it's not in the category of valuable. It's actually quite new. It's from the 60s. It's a tiny little plate.
Still though.
I know, I claim to have it. I'm a poser, as they say, right?
Nothing wrong with that.
Thank you. I feel vindicated. I think I saw a comment go by. Let's see. Going to afternoon tea at a French resto in Wheaton next month called Suzette's. Ooh, well, good luck with that. But I'll tell you the mistakes I made, just so you don't step in them. When I was first served loose leaf tea at a tea room in a teapot, I forgot that I'm going to need to filter that tea. And this is the series of events that ensue. I was given a tea strainer, then it fit over my teacup. I ignore this. So I pour the tea directly into my cup, and then I see it's full of tea leaves. And oh, well, there is no graceful way to get that tea back and try it again. The ship has sailed, shall we say. But I did it anyway, and I probably shouldn't have, but I did. I tipped it back into the teapot and tried again, and then I dripped tea on their tablecloth, which is a big taboo. Don't do that. So it worked out in the end, but I don't think I was observed too keenly. This is good.
Okay, anybody else? Any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you very much for coming, Claire. We really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Thank you all for coming tonight.